Today we're going to talk about what most doctors won't tell you about your risk for having a stroke, and it has to do with something that you're probably doing every single morning. And if you continue to do this after you turn 60, you are going to triple your risk of having a stroke. So make sure you stay tuned and find out what that is. If you like what you see, please share this with your friends and family so that they can benefit as well. So let's talk about this one thing that you can do every single morning that if you continue doing it past the age of 60, you're gonna triple your risk of having a stroke. What is that? Well, if you guessed eating eggs every morning, you would be right. Eggs are a great source of protein and healthy fats. They're good for building muscle and keeping you full and satisfied, and have been part of many diets, including the ketogenic diet, which I've talked about before, where you eat lots of eggs and meat and little to no carbohydrates. But recently, there's been a lot of concern about eggs and whether or not they increase your risk of heart disease and, as a result, increase your risk of a stroke. A lot of this concern comes from a study called the Nurses' Health Study, which followed over 80,000 nurses over the course of 30 years, starting in 1976. In this study, they looked at how dietary habits, including eating eggs, changed the risk of developing heart disease and having a heart attack. What they found was that those who ate more than one egg per day had a higher risk of developing heart disease compared to those who ate less than one egg per week. However, this study did have some limitations. One limitation was that the nurses were mostly women, so we can't generalize the results to men. Another limitation is that the study relied on the nurses to accurately report their dietary intake. And, unfortunately, people aren't always accurate when recalling what they eat over the course of many days. Also, the study just looked at the association between eating eggs and heart disease. It didn't prove that eating eggs caused an increase in heart disease. There could have been other factors that the study didn't account for, such as other dietary habits or lifestyle factors. However, despite these limitations, several organizations, including the American Heart Association, recommend limiting the intake of dietary cholesterol, which is found in foods such as eggs, to less than 200 milligrams per day for most people. The reason for this recommendation is that dietary cholesterol can contribute to high levels of cholesterol in the blood, which is a risk factor for heart disease and stroke. But here's the thing. Recent studies have actually challenged this long-held belief that eating eggs increases your risk of heart disease and stroke. The first study I want to talk about is called the Egg Study, which was published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2019. This study was a randomized clinical trial where researchers studied the effects of eating eggs on people with a history of cardiovascular disease. Participants were instructed to eat one extra egg per day in addition to their regular diet. And researchers found that eating an additional egg per day did not increase the risk of major cardiovascular events such as heart attacks or strokes. In fact, the results showed that eating an extra egg per day might actually be safe for people with a history of cardiovascular disease. However, the researchers did acknowledge that the study had some limitations. One limitation was that the participants in the study were already at high risk of heart disease because they had a history of cardiovascular disease. So we don't know if the same results would apply to people without a history of cardiovascular disease. Another limitation is that the study only followed participants for 12 weeks, so any long-term effects of eating extra eggs were unknown. But another study published in the British Medical Journal in 2021 sought to address these limitations by studying people without cardiovascular disease. In this study, researchers analyzed data from over 17,000 adults who participated in the UK Biobank study. Participants completed food frequency questionnaires, and researchers used this data to estimate their dietary cholesterol intake. They also underwent blood tests to measure their cholesterol levels. Researchers then followed participants over the course of an average of 9 years to see who developed cardiovascular disease. After 9 years, researchers found that the people with the highest estimated dietary cholesterol intake had a lower risk of developing cardiovascular disease compared to those with the lowest intake. These findings were consistent regardless of whether participants had high or low cholesterol levels in their blood. Although this study did not specifically look at the risk of stroke, cardiovascular disease includes stroke. So these results may suggest that eating eggs does not increase the risk of stroke. But what about people over the age of 60? We know that the risk of stroke increases with age. In fact, about 60% of all strokes occur in people who are 65 years or older. But what about people over the age of 60 who eat eggs every morning? Does that increase their risk of stroke? Well, we don't have any studies that specifically looked at this question. However, I would argue that based on the previously discussed studies, eating eggs does not increase the risk of stroke in people over the age of 60. The strongest study that showed an increased risk of heart disease with eating more than one egg per day was done in people who already had cardiovascular disease, meaning that they already had an increased risk of having a stroke or a heart attack. And the other study that showed an increased risk of heart disease with eating more eggs was done in people over the age of 60. However, those people also had cardiovascular disease, meaning that they already had an increased risk of having a stroke or a heart attack. The study that showed no increased risk of heart disease with eating more eggs was done in people who did not have cardiovascular disease, meaning that they were at a lower risk of having a stroke or a heart attack. So based on the available evidence, I don't think that eating eggs increases the risk of stroke in people over the age of 60 who don't already have cardiovascular disease. That being said, I do think that it's important to consider the source of dietary cholesterol. If it comes from processed meats or fried foods, then it's likely to be less healthy and potentially increase your risk of cardiovascular disease and stroke. However, if it comes from whole foods like eggs, it's probably not going to have the same negative effect. However, I do need to mention that everyone is different, and what works for one person may not work for another. People with certain risk factors for cardiovascular disease, such as diabetes, high blood pressure, or high cholesterol, may need to be more careful about their dietary cholesterol intake. I highly recommend working with a registered dietitian who can help you determine the appropriate amount of cholesterol for your individual needs and help you develop a healthy eating plan that meets your dietary needs while keeping your risk of cardiovascular disease and stroke in mind. And if you're over the age of 60, please talk to your doctor about what you can safely eat. You may want to limit your dietary cholesterol intake to less than 200 milligrams per day, but that doesn't mean that you can't eat eggs. Just make sure you're also eating a healthy diet with plenty of fruits, vegetables, and whole grains. In addition to your diet, there are other things you can do to reduce your risk of stroke, such as maintaining a healthy weight, getting regular exercise, not smoking, and managing any underlying health conditions such as diabetes or high blood pressure. By taking these steps, you can keep yourself safe and reduce your risk of stroke as you age. If you liked this video, please hit the like button below and leave me a comment. And if you haven't already, please subscribe and share my videos with your friends and family. As always, you can find me on social media. I'll see you next time.